policy, but in view of Allan's and Noam Chomsky's expertise in this field, I'm going to talk about something different. And that is what, in my view, is Indonesians' policy in East Timor, something about why the massacre actually occurred, and why I think basically the game is already over from the point of view of Jakarta. Let me begin with a story. I'm going to make this as short as I can, that some of you may be aware of, which is that last month a small, sort of looked like a Mississippi ferry boat, was chartered with Portuguese funding to sail on a mission from the north of Australia into the harbour at Dili with the express idea of laying wreaths, expressing solidarity with the people who were killed in the massacre. And on this boat, I think not more than 100 students, journalists of different countries and so forth. Basically, people who wanted to express some kind of solidarity. This is a very small boat, not armed in any way at all. Well, this boat, at first sight, seemed to throw the Indonesian government into a complete panic. The head of the Navy said, major preparations were underway. The whole Navy was going to be thrown into the effort to stop this Mississippi ferry boat from penetrating subversively into Indonesian waters. The police, the army, the Marines all chimed in. And rather to my astonishment, newspapers showed detailed, as it were, plans for the defense of Dili, of East Timor, against this dangerous invasion. But what's really interesting is this, that in the accounts given by the general who Allan referred to, General Theo Shafii, who's just moved in to replace the previous commander, he said that we have 3 battle lines to defend the capital of East Timor against the invasion. And the 3 battle lines, of course, first was the Indonesian Navy out there patrolling the waters with guns ready. The next battle line was slight come down, it's immigration officers and the police. And then the third one that really counted, of course, is the military. So you had a 3-line defense against this invasion, rather different invasion from the one of 1975. But this had its sort of comic aspects to it. But what is very interesting is what then followed, because as the general began to talk on and on and on, he began to use a very strange kind of language, which I've never seen. I've been watching Indonesian politics for a long time, 25 years probably. And he began to use a language about what was going on in East Timor, which was really quite interesting. Because for years the Indonesian generals have been saying, well, it's all over about the shouting. There's just a few guerrillas up in the hills, just 2 or 3 there, got no guns left. It's all finished, it's all finished, it's all finished. Did you hear me? It's all finished, and so forth. And what the general now is saying is something quite extraordinary. What he is saying is that we have to be very careful, because if the boat arrives in the harbor, then there might be a muck by the masses. And it would be extremely dangerous if the masses, he always uses this word, massa, would get out of hand. We recognize that the massa are very difficult to face. It's the task of every military officer to understand how to face the massa. No explanation, of course, where these masses have come from. And this, it seems to me, is very striking, because that this very hardline officer, in fact, is no longer talking the language of 3 or 4 people up in the hills, but is talking about masses who have to be a 3-line defense. It really has to be set up against, is in fact a backhanded recognition of what is now increasingly clear to people, I think, in the military themselves. That the gamble that was taken in 1975, that you could go in there, take over this place, kill off what was necessary in the terms of resistance, frighten the population, and then what you would do, the next step would be to fully absorb it into the country. And it's important to understand what that absorption involves. The calculation is, and it's an old calculation of occupying forces in many countries around the world, You get rid of the guys who are in power, you terrify the rest of the population, and then, because you don't want to kill everybody in the eyes, and there's no point in that, what you do, what you want to do, is to get the kids. And you won't understand Indonesian policy in Timor unless you realize alongside the prison camps, alongside the executions, alongside the torture, alongside the genocidal populations at certain points, there is also, and this is very typical of colonialism, you find it in British, French colonialism, you do genocide and you educate. You torture and you build roads. It's a very classical policy. And in fact, what has actually happened in East Timor under Indonesian rule is that, in fact, a lot of roads have been built, that a lot of office buildings. Dili now is a city in 4 or 5 times the size what it was when the Indonesians invaded. Many, many, many Timorese have, in fact, been put in school, told to read Indonesian books, taught Indonesian languages, and then, of course, find that there's no jobs for them when they get out of the schooling system. Timorese kids have been sent to universities in Indonesia, in Java, just as the Dutch used to send Indonesian students to study in Holland. Indonesians have, up to a certain point, permitted the church to operate, and that has meant that the church has now about twice as many people in Timor as faithful followers of the church as it had at the time of the invasion. That is, what I'm really trying to say here is that the irony of this is that Indonesia has actually done exactly what the Dutch and the French and the British colonials did before them. Same calculations are there. And what they're finding is what they should have realized, actually, if they'd looked at their own history. The Dutch colonized Indonesia for 300 years, brutalized it, exploited it, tortured, murdered, but they also built roads, they also constructed factories, they also began late in the game, but they definitely did, to put them in school. And of course it's precisely out of the schools, precisely out of the newspapers, precisely out of the modernization of life in the colony that the Indonesian nationalist movement emerged, which could never be turned back. It was only a matter of time before Indonesia would become an independent state. And I think what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, I have to say this frankly, that 8 or 9 years ago, 9, 10 years ago, when I used to go on talks like this, I was very pessimistic. I thought maybe the gamble might pay off, that so much deterioration, so much damage had been done to the Timorese that it was finished. But now I think the evidence is clear that, in fact, it's the Indonesian policy that's finished. There's no way of getting this back now. They've lost the younger generation. Kids. Those are the kids who were in the demonstration. Notice that many of those children were under 17 years old, under 20 years old. If so, they don't even remember the pre-Indonesian period. Carpetbaggers coming in to a small town which was traditionally theirs. I mean, they are perfectly aware of what's going on. And that consciousness, that solidarity, can't be destroyed and can't be turned back. Last May, I think it was, the SSRC sponsored a meeting on East Timor in Washington, to which, rather to our surprise, a senior Indonesian military intelligence officer showed up. But the most interesting person at that meeting was a young man called Dolenciano Gomez, a boy about 19 years old who'd actually been a leader of the organized protests to try and get in touch with the Pope when the Pope came to Dili some years ago. He'd been arrested and tortured for that. He managed to get out to Lisbon, and he'd come over to the United States. And what was extraordinary was that, without any sense of irony, Dolenciano and I spoke to each other. I didn't know Portuguese. His English was very shaky. We spoke to each other happily in Indonesian. That was the language of communication between us. So the idea that you could, that the language somehow does you in, of course, isn't true at all. It was then taken off to the Washington post offices, where he found somebody high up on, I was going to say Jason Robard's staff, but you'll get my point, who was a Portuguese speaker, and they chatted happily in Portuguese together, even though Portuguese has effectively been legally banned by the Indonesians for a long time. And the interesting thing was to watch that boy and